Last week, we talked about Tim Connors. He's the guy who got the Seattle Seahawks Super Bowl champs tattoo this past August. There he is. That guy has had the most amazing week that you could ever imagine, correct? Oh, my word. It seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? The Super Bowl? Doesn't it? It's kind of weird. It's been a week. We're saying that to somebody this morning, it's been a week ago, and it just seems like forever. But I think Bruno Mars has had a great week as well. It was a big night for him. But this guy, when he got the tattoo last August, there were Seattle Seahawks fans who were angry at him because they thought he was jinxing the team, sports superstition. And so you've got a guy who loves the Seahawks, obviously thinks they're going to go to the Super Bowl. He also has a Golden Girls tattoo, so maybe he's not making good judgments necessarily with his choice of tattoos, but he loves the Seahawks. But when he got that tattoo, he was criticized by other people who love the Seahawks. That tells me that even people who root for the same team can have disagreements about how to support their team. There are all kinds of differences that we experience in life between each other, to the extent that even people who agree on a lot of things can still disagree on a few things. And if we're not careful, those disagreements, those differences, can begin to divide us. Even people who want to be a part of the same team, those differences between us, those disagreements that we experience, can divide us. Last week we talked about external forces in the world, stress and busyness and all the things that we have to do that threaten to pull us apart from the people we love, family and friends and people who are close to us. This week, we're talking about really internal forces, differences in personality in people in our family and in our church and in your workplace, and differences in seeing the world, and cultural differences, ethnic differences, differences of sexual orientation, differences of religion and theological beliefs, differences on politics, differences of opinion on all kinds of matters. And if we're not careful, those differences that we experience can pull us apart from people that we would really like to be in a good relationship with. People in our family, close friends of ours, people in our church. Those differences that we experience as an everyday part of life also threaten to pull us apart. Those differences can range from cultural issues, the big issues, to issues in a marriage or in a dating relationship. We know that we live in a culture that is politically polarized. We have people who vote for Team Red and people who vote for Team Blue. And our country is more polarized than it's been in several decades, and that's just the environment we live in. The Christian church around the world agrees on some things, but there are a lot of things that we don't agree on. If I made you guess, how many Christian denominations do you think there are in the world? Somebody shout out a number, just for fun. How many denominations do you think there are? 500. How many? I heard some thousands. Who? What? 15,000? According to Gordon Conwell Seminary, which is a reputable seminary in Boston, there are 43,000 Christian denominations in the world. Isn't that shocking? I would have never guessed that, and I don't know exactly. I mean, maybe they're counting, in really small clusters of churches as a part of a denomination, but 43,000. That's up from 34,000 10 years ago. It was 1,600 in 1990. So just think about, just within the Christian church, people who want to follow Jesus, all the different differences. That's redundantly redundant, I think. The disagreements, the differences that can divide and threaten to pull us apart. Here at One Church, our first value is One Church is a safe place to express your questions and doubts. And people do. And so what happens when people do is that, I hear something that I disagree with. And then we're faced with a decision, how do I handle this difference? We have that right here in our congregation. We have people from all kinds of religious backgrounds, people who vote differently, people from different ethnic backgrounds and different family backgrounds and different parts of the world and different parts of the country. And how are we going to deal with those differences in our church? In your workplace, you experience those differences if you work outside of the home. So we have many opportunities to let differences divide us, don't we? If you were to think over, let's just take the past year. Think over the past year of your life. How much energy have you spent either trying to resolve conflict or run from it, or dealing with differences of some kind, or feeling stressed about them in your family, in your workplace, or among your friends? How much energy have you spent over the past year dealing with differences in your life? You think about that for a second? When I think about it, I mean, it's possible that that's what I've spent the most energy on. Or do you follow me? Dealing with differences of opinion, and these folks want this, and these folks want that, and I think this, and it's possible that I've actually spent the most energy. But like, what happens if this person's angry, and I don't want to lose that relationship, and it just seems like, wow, I mean, just keeping us together in spite of our differences takes a lot of energy. The main theme of Ephesians, in this series that we're in, we're all in this together, Ephesians, is oneness, togetherness, unity. It's all about people who could be pulled apart, but how do we pull them together? And it's a message that we need in many ways. And we have two goals for this series. Number one, we want to read Ephesians and apply practical wisdom from Ephesians to our lives. The second goal is we want to learn some basic tools for interpreting the Bible in the 21st century. We want to be a church for thinking people who believe we can take the Bible seriously. But how do you do that when you read some things in the Bible and we're just not sure how to reconcile those with our lives in the 21st century? So we're doing both of those things. Our scripture passage comes from Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 22. And it's about the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in the first century, 1900 years ago. And there may be some who are like, why? I didn't wake up this morning thinking about Jews and Gentiles. What, is that really relevant to our lives? Actually, there are a few people here in one church who are Jewish. So it's immediately relevant to their lives. But it's relevant to all of us for several reasons, and among which is it's just a great teaching passage on how do we overcome differences and disagreements we face and learn to do life together. One little tidbit before we read the passage. This passage mentions the practice of circumcision, which if you're familiar with ancient Jewish religion, one of the markers of somebody who was an observant Jew was that Jewish males would be circumcised. And so I always empathize when we talk about things like this with somebody who's like, I wanted to go to church for the first time in a long time, and I showed up, and they're talking about surgical procedures on sensitive areas. Like, why? I want to just listen to the sermon without squirming the entire time. So I empathize with those folks. It's awkward to say the word circumcision, but it's less awkward if I say it now than if you just read it without explanation in the passage. Like, what's that? Do I have to do that to be a member of the church? Like, is that a requirement? So it mentions that, and it was a practice found in ancient Judaism and other Middle Eastern cultures, and it found its way into the Bible. All right? But let's read the passage. Ephesians chapter 2. Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles, non-Jews by birth, and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands. We don't need any more graphic detail than that. Remember that at that time, you Gentiles, you non-Jews, remember at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, again referring to the Jews, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, the promise and the covenants that God made with the Jewish people, the agreements God made with them, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away, you Gentiles, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. So the author so far is saying Jesus, something about Jesus, allows Gentiles to be included with the Jewish people as God's chosen people. We're just following the thought line of the author. Verse 14. For Jesus himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, Jews and Gentiles one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, Jews and Gentiles, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who are far away and peace to those who are near, for through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone or capstone that holds the building together. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. Will you pray with me? Oh God, we thank you for the time that we have to share this morning together with a church body who has come together this morning to worship you and to grow, where we can express our questions and doubts, where we know we don't have to be perfect, where we want to make a difference with our lives in this world, not just the world to come. God, we all carry our baggage in with us this morning, disagreements and differences, and the pain from those conflicts and disagreements and differences in the past. God, we all carry a certain amount of pain. We all have our stories. So God, as we explore this passage, and we may be pleasantly surprised by how relevant it is to us, we pray, God, that you would give us open minds and open hearts, and that you would be able to do some kind of healing work in our lives, even in ways that surprise us this morning, that you would touch us at our deepest point of need. We're all looking for reconciliation, God, and oneness and togetherness. So God, we open ourselves to you to allow you to heal us and make that possible today in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. If you're taking notes in your worship handout, the people living in biblical cultures experience the same differences that we experience. Human nature has not changed in the past 2,000 years, even if that passage sounds foreign to you. The writer of Ephesians says that Jesus broke down a wall of hostility between two groups, Jews and Gentiles, people who had differences of ethnicity and religion, political differences, and cultural differences. Now, unfortunately, throughout church history over the past 2,000 years, that passage has not really played out the way that we would hope. 300 years after Jesus, Christians began systematically persecuting Jewish people. And for the past 1,700 years, people who are Jewish around the world have had to deal with some very difficult circumstances, and often because Christians didn't really help them. And so, unfortunately, there has been hostility, and that's really the fault of the Christian church over the centuries. But a truly Christian stance, a Jesus-like stance, is to make peace. And so 1,900 years ago, when Ephesians was written, there was a growing rift between Jews and Gentiles. Why are we talking about this again? Well, all of the early Christians were Jews. Jesus was Jewish. There are some people who are surprised by that. Everybody who followed Jesus at first was a Jew. All of the writers of every biblical book, except for Luke and Acts, as far as we know, were Jews. So, as people who want to follow Jesus, the Jewish faith it's our roots. It's our beginning. It's how we started. And even if we just want to grow as Christians, it's just something we have to know. It's just a part of how we started. But in the first century, this rift was taking place. There was a religious difference. Because when Jesus came, there was this belief in the Hebrew scriptures that God would send the Messiah. And the Messiah is kind of like a God-sent human superhero who would make everything right in the world. And so there were Jews who believed that Jesus was God's promised Messiah. And then there were those who didn't believe that Jesus was God's promised Messiah. Well, there's a religious difference right there. And over time, that rift grew wider and wider apart. All the earliest Christians taught in synagogues, which are gatherings of Jewish people for worship. But over time, that rift grew, that theological difference grew, and it grew to the point that, okay, this isn't really the same faith in all of its details anymore. There's still a lot of connections, but there was enough of a difference that Christians eventually left the synagogue. There was a theological difference. Some of us have religious and theological differences with people close to us. Understatement of the week, possibly, for some of us. There were also political differences. This is in the time of the Roman Empire. Both Jews and Christians were a tiny religious minority who were frightened because they both were in danger continually of facing persecution at the hands of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is the area around the Mediterranean Sea, northern Africa and Europe and parts of the Middle East. And both Jews and Christians were a small group that were terrified that they would be persecuted, killed, ruined financially for their faith. And one difference is that people who were practicing Jews had a little bit of legal protection in the Roman Empire because the Romans respected older, more established religions, and Judaism was that. So Jews were somewhat protected. So what people who were Jewish wanted to do generally was just fly under the radar, just kind of go unnoticed by the Roman Empire, because every time the Romans pay attention to us, we end up dead. So we just don't want any attention from the Roman Empire. At the same time, Christians didn't really have that legal protection. Some don't realize that, religion and politics have always been fused together. They don't realize that there were political situations back in the early church in the times of the Bible. Christians didn't really have that protection. So Christians wanted to say to the Romans, they wanted to get the attention of the Romans and say, no, we're really Jews. We're Jews who accepted the Jewish Messiah, because they wanted the legal protection from persecution that Jews had. Are you following me? Does this make sense? The plot thickens. It's getting complicated. So the Jewish people were like, please don't make any noise. We don't want the attention of the Romans on us. And the Christians are like, no, we want their attention. We're really Jews. And so there was a political difference that got serious very quickly. People's lives were at stake. You can imagine. If you feel like your family's being threatened with death or financial ruin, you're like, leave us alone. Go worship somewhere else. We disagree with you. Leave. And so there was a widening rift about politics. Maybe some of you have political differences with people close to you. There was obviously also a cultural divide. As more Gentiles, non-Jews, became Christians, well, there was just an ethnic and cultural difference that led to that rift as well, that difference, that divide, that intensified as during the time of the first century. By about 100 AD, the separation had been made to where people who were practicing Jews and people who were practicing Christians were really separate entities. Ephesians, we don't really know, but it could have been written anytime between 60 and 80, about the same time as the Gospels. And it's a time when that rift was intensifying. Some of the comments that you read about Jews in the New Testament, you wouldn't want to repeat today. You wouldn't want to quote them without a large amount of context to explain what we're reading about in the New Testament is kind of an interfamily squabble between two tiny religious minorities. It's not like it is today where there are, 2 billion Christians in the world, and we live in a world that's post-Holocaust. And we've seen what happens when people make anti-Semitic statements and that gets into the water, and then a crazy dictator comes along and throws people into a gas chamber. We live in a very different culture than the first century, but that rift widened. Now, people in the Bible didn't just disagree over the big issues. They were just like us. They disagreed over small, petty things as well. All the families that we come from are a different culture. And our parents have a way of doing things, and we grow up and we do it that way. And if you get into a relationship with somebody, you quickly discover, correct, that not everybody does things the way I do. So in the first few weeks of our marriage, Hannah and I were doing laundry one day, and I'm taking more credit for that than I should. And we sat down on our couch to fold the laundry, and we got to the socks. And she was being sweet, like she grabbed some of my socks and she started folding them. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I better grab some of her socks then and start folding them. So I did. And we paid attention in the first few seconds to how each of us was folding socks. So here's how I fold socks. We're done. I call it the tuck. It's not complicated. Do we have any tuckers in here today? 40%. Thank you for the applause. I appreciate that. That's how I fold socks. So we're just sitting on the couch, laundry basket next to us, and that's just folding socks. I look over at my wife. Here's how Hannah folds socks. She matches them up perfectly, toes and heels, and then she rolls them like this. And then she tucks this part all the way around, so it's like this little ball. And I'm like, that takes like 30 seconds per pair of socks. I'm like, that's not how you fold socks? What are you... And I'm like, think about all the time you're wasting in life, taking that much time folding socks. Like, I'm going to save like a year of my life folding socks by doing it, the tuck method. And she's like, that's not how you fold socks. When she looked at my tuck method, I'm like, you're wasting all this time. And she's like, well, your socks just come unfolded, so you're wasting time. You shouldn't even fold them. And I'm like, well, they're all the same, so I shouldn't fold them anyway, right? And then So it didn't turn, I'm glad I can say it didn't turn into a real fight, but we had a discussion. We'll say it like that. In the first few weeks of our marriage about how, holy cow, how we're folding socks. And we probably fold socks the way our parents fold. This is how my mom folded socks. So that's the right way, right? And Hannah's mom did it a different way, and that was the right way. And so if we get defensive about how to fold socks because we think that's the right way, goodness, how do we handle differences that actually matter in life? The world will not be changed according to how we fold socks. And we assume that our way is the right way until we enter into relationship with someone else. And we get close enough to that person that we experience, oh, I guess my way isn't the only way of folding socks. And now I'm faced with a decision about how I'm going to handle this difference. And all real relationships experience that conflict. If there is no conflict, it's not a real relationship. You're not really close, or somebody's pretending. Somebody's saying, oh, I guess that's the right way to fold socks. Or I guess that's the right way to be faithful in a marriage. Or I guess that's the right way to communicate by yelling and demeaning. And so either we're not really that close or somebody is pretending. All relationships experience that conflict. Now, every week in this series, we want to just take a few minutes and learn something about how to interpret the Bible. And you can see one of the big differences, even in the way this passage is written, actually. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15 of the passage we read. The differences between Jews and Gentiles had intensified to the point that there was name calling. There was name calling people without God, hopeless. I mean, it doesn't mean anything to us, but in that time and in those circumstances, those names actually did mean something. But one of the most interesting verses is verse 15. And I think we have it here. It says, "For he himself is our peace, Jesus is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility by," and I underline these words, "setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations." In his flesh is a clause, meaning in his body, in Jesus' body. But the sentence says, he set aside the law. Now, the law they're referring to is the Jewish law, which starts with the 10 Commandments, the Big Ten. And then in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, there are 613 commandments built around that. And the idea is the other commandments are kind of like a fence. If I don't break these other commandments, I'll never come close to breaking the Big Ten. And so there's 613 commandments that an observant Jew would follow. And so the author says in verse 15 that Jesus has set aside this law. The Greek word for set aside there, the NIV, the New International Version, has actually softened this translation. The Greek word there means to abolish or nullify or end, do away with. He has abolished the law, the Jewish law. Now, if you're not, if you're not living in theology world like I do, you might be like, oh, what's the big deal? I don't get it. But for people who do have some familiarity with this discussion in the Bible, this is actually a really big deal of a statement. It's shocking to people who have some familiarity with the Bible and the relationship with Jews and Gentiles. Let me show you why. Let's look at a statement that the Apostle Paul makes in Romans 3. A lot of things here you may or may not understand, but wait till we get to verse 31. Paul says, "Where then is boasting? It is excluded. Because of what law? The law that requires works? No, because of the law that requires faith." He's talking about the Jewish law. "For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles too? Yes, of the Gentiles too, since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith," there's that word again, "and the uncircumcised through that same faith." Watch, verse 31. "Do we then nullify the law by this faith?" What's the answer? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. That's interesting. So in 2:15, it says Christ nullified or abolished the law. Paul says in Romans 3:31 that we don't nullify or abolish it. Those are two opposite statements, correct? Let's read the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, "Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to" what? abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear. Until its purpose is achieved. This sounds different from Ephesians 2:15, doesn't it? Are you tracking with me here? I know we're kind of like in theological weeds territory, but hang with me for a second. So if you look at this, if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. If we just had Ephesians, we would think that Jesus has done away with the Jewish law. Now, Christians don't have to observe the Jewish law, but it doesn't mean that we think that it's done away with, that it's just not true, that it's bad, But if you read Ephesians, are you with me? All right. If you read Ephesians, you think, well, Jesus has done away with the law, but that stands in direct contradiction to Paul's statement in Romans and Jesus' statement in Matthew. Is that interesting? When you read something in the Bible, and we can just make a list, right? When you read something in the Bible, wait a second, that isn't quite square. Like God commands genocide in the Old Testament, and then Jesus tells us to love our enemies. Turn the cheek. What? How do you reconcile these things? These seem to be two different opposing statements. And so watch biblical commentators become acrobats, trying to explain what's going on here. Some will say, well, it's a mistranslation, but every reputable English translation translates it from the original Greek like this. It's what makes sense in Greek. Some would say, well, what it means is Jesus set aside the ceremonial parts of the Jewish law, but not the moral law. Well, but it doesn't say that. It says set apart the law. If we're just reading it and using reading comprehension, what do we do with this? Last week, we said one of the keys to interpreting the Bible is to mind the gap, to realize that our culture is much different from the cultures that produce the biblical books. There's an enormous gap between our culture and their culture, and that gap has to be considered when we interpret the Bible. But here's a second thing, if you're taking notes. The Bible is not one book. The Bible is a collection of books. We would call that a library. The Bible is a library, so the 66 biblical books in the Protestant Bible, at least, do not speak with one voice on every subject they address. The fact that we have a Bible between two covers helps to create the assumption that some churches have and teach that every single statement in the Bible agrees with all the others. That if you read something in Leviticus, it agrees with something in Romans, that everything can be harmonized. It's like a thesis paper. And if you trace that back, the belief is really that every single word comes from God. And of course, if it comes from God, it's not going to disagree. There's going to be internal harmony. But then the issue comes when people read the Bible and they see that, oh my goodness, there are all kinds of statements that really appear to be different from other statements. There seem to be all kinds of disagreements in this. And so there are folks who are well-meaning Christians who claim that there is always internal agreement in everything in the Bible, and they kind of set the Bible up to be cross-examined by people who are skeptical of it, and those people read it, and they're like, oh, it's full of contradictions. And so you have this false dichotomy set up where it's like the Bible can't win. You have people who are well-intentioned, who love the Bible, but they want to make the Bible say things it doesn't say about the Bible. The Bible doesn't claim to be internally coherent on all matters. And if a Bible in its original form would have been scrolls and papyri in different places, there would be no reason to think that they all agree between the books and the scrolls. But the fact that it's between two covers can help create that assumption. And then people who maybe are hostile to religion already come along and they're able to just shoot it down. It's full of contradictions and not take it seriously. So the Bible is a library. Imagine if somebody walked into a public library and they went up to the info counter and they said to the librarian, listen, I noticed you have Shakespeare here and you also have Plato. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but they have very different views of the world. And your library is full of contradictions. And I mean, can you imagine if somebody said that? First of all, the librarian would probably call the cops. But then while the cops are on the way, the librarian might explain the purpose of a library is not to preserve a bunch of books that agree with each other on every topic they touch. The purpose of a library is to preserve various conversations because they're all important. And when there's an important issue in our world, it's good to have different viewpoints on them. That's actually good. That's the purpose of a library. And then the cops would come. But that's how people treat the Bible. There are Christians who are well-meaning, but they set the Bible up, by saying things about the Bible that the Bible doesn't say. And then there are skeptical people who come along, and it's just such an easy target to knock down. Well, what if the Bible is a library, and there are various viewpoints on some of these issues? I could just go to town and create a list of all the things that we might have trouble with. So mind the gap, week 1. There's an enormous difference between our culture and the culture that produced the biblical books. And then this week, the nugget, I think, is the Bible's a library. Don't expect that every single statement in the Bible is going to agree with every other statement. It preserves conversations and opposing viewpoints because they're important. Point made? All right. And we're going to build on this next week and every week. Let's try to create a list of some basics to interpreting the Bible. Okay. What does this passage tell us about growing closer together with people we love in spite of the differences that we have and the disagreements we have and the conflicts that can come out of those? How do we keep these differences from pulling our families apart and pulling our friendships apart and our church family apart and your relationship with your coworkers? How do we overcome those differences? Well, like we said, conflict is a part of everyday life. It cannot be avoided. We can't run from it. And so it has to be dealt with. In this passage, I believe God speaks through this passage. I believe somehow, in some way that I can't totally explain, God inspired the biblical authors to the extent that God can speak through. It's a faith statement, I know that. But that God speaks through this passage in powerful ways to you right now where you sit in Chandler and to me. So what does this passage say about overcoming these differences? Well, in verses 13 through 15, part of what we just read, we also read that Jesus shed his blood, and the phrase, in his flesh, destroyed the barrier of hostility between two different groups of people, making the two one instead of two. Now, the shedding blood and the in his flesh phrases refer to the cross. The first thing that people learn about Jesus probably after Christmas is Easter, that Jesus grew up and that Jesus was crucified. For some reason, Jesus was put on a cross, which is a Roman instrument of torture and execution. Jesus was tortured to death and executed on a cross. And Roman soldiers would just find 2 pieces of wood or maybe a tree, and they would nail a piece of wood to it. And they would nail people's hands and feet to that piece of wood until they die, and would mock them and make fun of them while they died. And it could take days. It's an awful, nasty, bloody, ugly, painful, torturous, mocking, embarrassing way to die. And this was common in the Roman world. And it was excruciating, which comes from the word crucifixion. Excruciating comes from crucifixion. And this is what Jesus did, was he voluntarily allowed himself to be put on the cross and crucified. Now, the early Christians had many ways of understanding what that means. They were coming out of an ancient religion where animals were sacrificed to the gods, and so they viewed Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice for sin, for the harmful things that go on in our world. There were other ways of saying that Jesus defeated evil, even in the face of evil perpetuated by the Roman Empire. Jesus didn't strike back violently, but he allowed himself to be tortured as a way to say, this is how you overcome evil. You overcome evil with good and nonviolence. And Jesus taught us how to live in that way. But one of the understandings was that Jesus shows us how to be reconciled with other people. When we are attacked, when we have differences between us that threaten to pull us apart, and maybe there's some conflict, and maybe there's some serious hurt going on there, Jesus shows us how to respond to that in a way that actually brings peace that the author speaks about. And the way Jesus shows us is not by lashing back, not by striking back when we're struck, but by allowing ourselves to absorb the pain that is caused by these conflicts and these differences, and not trying to return that pain to somebody else, which just creates a cycle of violence and attacking and more disagreements and more conflict. But to absorb that, and somehow in doing so, to set the example that this is my posture toward you. I'm not going to attack you back. I'm going to absorb the pain that you've inflicted upon me. And I want to make peace. And we can make peace if you want to make peace. But somehow the cross means that as well. So if you're taking notes, reconciling with others despite our differences is costly and painful. It's also worth it, if at all possible. Now I want to make the disclaimer. I'm not talking about people who are in an abusive relationship. There are people who hear what I just said, and they're like, well, I'll let him keep hitting me then. Hear me. That is not my point. There are people who allow themselves to be doormats. That's not what I'm saying. If you're in an abusive situation, get out of the abusive situation. It often becomes worse. Usually doesn't get better, it becomes worse. And so if you and the kids are in an abusive situation, get out of that and get to a safe place. I'm not talking about enabling an abuser to abuse even more. I'm talking about the differences and conflicts that we face in life. And if you're taking notes, there's a book I'm quoting here called Human Intimacy by Frank Cox. And he says, one of the keys to living this out in our relationships, it could be a marriage, it could be a friendship, it could be disagreements in church or with coworkers, is understanding the difference between aversive communication and empathetic listening. If you want to write those two things, aversive communication versus empathetic listening. He gives us a definition of aversive communication. He says, one basic principle of human behavior is that people seek pleasure and avoid pain. But actually, people first avoid pain and then seek pleasure. Because in the hierarchy of human needs, pain avoidance is basic to survival. Unfortunately, the quickest means of changing the behavior of the partner who is giving us pain is to threaten him or her. That is to combat pain with aversive communication. You see his point? We want to avoid pain and seek pleasure, but the first impulse is to avoid pain. And so in any kind of a difference where we feel like there might be a disagreement or we're threatening conflict, the first thing we want to do is avoid the pain. Aversive means avoidance. We want to avoid the pain, and he says one of the ways we try to avoid is that we go on the attack. I'm not going to let you hurt me. Whatever the difference is between us or whatever you have to say to me or whatever you think about this issue, I'm not going to let you hurt me. It's aversive communication. He gives us an example between a couple. He says, an example of aversive communication is one that starts out dealing with one conflict but soon turns into a confusing kaleidoscope of other marginally related disagreements. This has never happened to us, right? That are connected only by the pain each partner causes the others. Where did you put my socks? You mean the socks I have to crawl under the bed to find every time I do the laundry? Yes, every time you do the laundry, the second Tuesday of every month. With a machine that's always broken that nobody fixes because I'm so busy working to pay for your tennis lessons and ladies' luncheons. You see how this works? The losses at Tuesday night poker bashes. I'm sick of this argument. Well, you started it. How? Well, I can't remember, but you did. It's an example of aversive attacking. I'm going to hurt you so you can't hurt me. I'm going to avoid dealing with this difference in this conflict so I'm not hurt. In contrast to aversive communication is empathetic listening. Empathy means to share in somebody else's emotion. It means to feel what that person is feeling. Empathy is an art. Connected with empathy is the idea of compassion, that I'm willing to suffer with someone else. That instead of avoiding and even attacking somebody else to avoid the discussion or dealing with the difference, I'm actually willing to suffer with that person, to feel that person's pain, so to speak, and to feel what that person is feeling. This isn't on the screen, but another quote from the author. Of all the skills we've been discussing, none is more important and often more difficult than that of being a good listener. We are all ready to offer our own thoughts and opinions, but are not so ready to listen to those of others. He says that empathetic listening is non-judgmental and accepting, and it involves feeling the emotion. This is hard, isn't it? Feeling the emotion of the other person we have a difference with, or disagreement or a conflict with. Feeling their emotion. It's not just hearing what they're saying, but it's feeling what they're saying. Suffering with them, entering into their experience enough to identify with their life and what's the thing behind the thing that's causing them to think and act the way they do. This is tough, isn't it? And feel that with them, to join with them, and even suffer with them. So, for example, if you're white, can you suffer with an African American view of the United States? If you were an evangelical Christian, can you suffer with another religion's view of the world? If you're a man, can you suffer with the plight of women? If you're a woman, can you suffer with men's challenges in the world? If you're straight, can you suffer with a gay person and his or her experience of the world? If you're a progressive Christian, can you suffer with a fundamentalist Christian and why he or she sees the world the way they do? Does this make sense? And all the differences and disagreements and conflicts that just riddle our society and divide churches, create 43,000 denominations and pull families apart and create arguments with coworkers that waste so much time and energy, and we're stressed out about it all the time. On the cross, the author of Ephesians says Jesus was empathetic toward you and me. That somehow in this act of allowing himself to be tortured and killed in an ugly way, Jesus suffered with our experience in the world and all of this brokenness and disagreement that we feel on a daily basis. And it breaks down the walls of hostility that separate different groups of people. So what if you've been hurt? I'm going to wrap up in a second. What if you've been hurt by these differences and conflicts and disagreements that have come out of these differences? What if the person's not really willing to listen to you and offer you empathy? What do? How do we respond? How can we be reconciled, if that's even possible, with people that have differences from us? And there's just been a lot of conflict there. Well, there's a word that's not in this passage, but it comes up a lot in churches because Jesus commands it, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. And so I just want to take a minute and talk about it. And in Christians, it's almost come to be known as the F word. It's the word forgiveness. And so people, even in my one group this past week, we submitted questions on index cards, and a couple people asked, how do I forgive? And I found that it's helpful to talk about what forgiveness means and what it doesn't mean. If you're keeping notes, maybe you want to write a couple things down in closing. Forgiveness means that I stop condemning somebody in my own mind. It means I release that person. It means that I am no longer the prosecuting attorney against that person. And really, it means that I'm not playing God, whose right alone it is to judge and condemn. And so forgiveness means that I release that person, and I no longer play God, and I'm able to let that person go. That's what forgiveness means. Now, here's the irony. In doing so, we discover that we were the ones who were really held captive. As it's been said, it's cliche and it's true. Not forgiving somebody is like drinking poison, wanting them to die. And it's holding on to something that happened to us, and it just tears us up. That person may not even care anymore. That person may not even be alive anymore. But if we don't forgive, it really eats at us, and it holds us captive. And forgiveness is just saying, you know what, I'm just going to let it go. Now, that could be a very long process of healing. It could be seeing a professional counselor for a long time before you get to that place. So I don't expect people to say, oh, okay, I'll forgive it then. Yeah, that's just not real life. Now, it also helps to understand what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not trust. Trust is earned over time. If trust has been thrown away, trust needs to be rebuilt, if possible. There are times when the abuse or the offense has been so horrendous, you really can't trust again. There are times when trusting wouldn't be wise. So forgiveness is not trust. Forgiveness can be an instant decision to release the person, but it doesn't mean you have to trust that person again. Does that help? Forgiveness also does not remove natural or legal consequences. If somebody committed a crime against you, you can forgive that person and press charges. Because in pressing charges, you may prevent that person from committing the crime towards somebody else. And there may be people who disagree with that. Well, I'm just trying to parse apart. Here's what forgiveness is and what it's not. There are also natural consequences to our actions. So forgiving doesn't mean pretending that it never happened. No. It doesn't mean rewriting the past. It just means I'm not going to play God and hold you captive to prosecute you. I'm just going to let you go. I'm going to let you into God's hands. But it doesn't mean that it takes away natural consequences. Third, forgiveness is not reconciliation. Reconciliation is always the goal, but it's not always possible. To be reconciled means that two become one. Two parties become one. Think of a horrendous thing that some people have experienced: molestation, rape, horrible physical or emotional abuse. You can forgive that person who hurt you. It may not be wise for you to ever reconcile with that person. You follow me? It just may not be feasible. It may not be wise. But you can still forgive. And it may be a long process of healing. But we believe that forgiveness is possible. We have God's Spirit, that the author of Ephesians talks about, who empowers us with the love of God. God loves me this much in spite of all my shortcomings. And God forgives me, so I'm just going to let that flow through me. If I don't feel like I have the power to forgive, I'm going to let God's power flow through me and do things that I don't think I can do. God, I'll let you forgive them through me. I don't have the ability to do this. I don't think, God, I need your help, but I want to forgive. If you'll just let your forgiveness flow through me. Maybe that would be your prayer. And I want to close with one 3-minute video that's a great illustration of this. You know, back in October of 2006, a young man invaded an Amish schoolhouse, a one-room schoolhouse, and just started shooting up the schoolhouse. He took these little Amish kids hostage. He eventually shot and killed 5 girls in the schoolhouse before he committed suicide. And this past December, CBS News ran a segment on gun violence in America. And they referred back to this Amish schoolhouse shooting as one of those examples. But check out the amazing example of forgiveness and reconciliation that took place in this community. So it's a 3-minute video. Let's check it out. We have so many things that threaten to pull us apart from the people we love, and differences and disagreements and conflicts. And there is great pain in our lives because of those things. Jesus gives us an example of, instead of attacking, instead of running away or avoiding, the very difficult example, but one that Jesus calls us to. And he doesn't call us to do anything he hasn't done. To enter in with empathic listening, to enter into the suffering of people who disagree with us, for people who are different than us, people who have caused this pain. And we enter into their lives and try the best we can to see life from their perspective. And that's the only way of making peace. It's the only thing that works. Now, that is not always possible. There can be offenses that are so great where, maybe through a process of healing, we can get to a place where we can forgive, we can release. Understanding forgiveness isn't trust, it's not pretending it didn't happen, it's not even reconciliation, so maybe we can release. Now, if reconciliation is possible, then great. It's always our goal to become one again where it's possible. But even if it's not, we release that person into God's hands and experience peace.